Good afternoon, everybody. How's everyone doing? My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I'm the Associate Director for the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. I want to welcome you to the second session of the Center's Religion and series. The first session was a dynamic and thought-provoking discussion on race and gender in the political landscape. And I want to thank Anthea Butler, Phil Goff, Melissa Borja, and Grace Yukich for a fantastic discussion and a great way to start off this series. The goal of this series is to continue the work that the Center has done for the last 32 years. The Center has been committed to bringing together scholars and practitioners to engage religion and its relationship to the most important questions in our fields and on our campuses and throughout our society. Every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, the Religion And will be a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and thinkers in multiple fields to continue these critically important conversations. Today, our second session examines religion and the 2020 election. Religion and politics are intimately intertwined in American civil life, especially when it comes to presidential elections. And in this panel, we will unpack the 2020 election, focusing on a number of topics, but particularly thinking about the role religion played in this last election, how campaigns and candidates reflected religious themes, and how did quote unquote religious Americans vote in this discussion. We have a powerhouse group of panelists this afternoon, and I am so excited for you to sit back and get ready for a thought-provoking and engaging discussion. Today, I want you to remember as we move throughout today's session, we're going to ask folks to submit their questions through the question and answer feature. You can see the directions right now on our screen. So do not use the chat feature, but please use our question and answer feature. And this will enable our hosts and our panelists to engage these questions as they facilitate this very important conversation. So without any further ado, let me introduce our host for this afternoon, and they will introduce the rest of our esteemed panel for today's discussion. Our hosts are Andrew Whitehead, who is an associate professor of sociology and the director of the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at IUPUI. That is a pretty long title, Dr. Whitehead. Dr. Whitehead's research focuses on how religion both shapes and is shaped by contemporary American culture. And he is most recently the author of Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. Our other co-host is my friend and colleague, the Associate Professor of Political Science and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and also a project director for the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture here at IUPUI. Amanda Friesen Research Center focuses on exploring the origins of political orientations, from policy prefaces to ideology to political interest and participation. She has published more than 25 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and currently serves on the Politics and Religion Journal editorial board. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Amanda and Andrew to lead us in today's fascinating discussion on religion and the 2020 election.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joseph, for that introduction. And welcome to all of you who are joining us. Amanda and I are so excited for our conversation with Dr. Jamil Drake and Dr. Janelle Wong. So allow me to introduce our distinguished panelists, and then I'll turn it over to Amanda to get us started. So today we have with us Dr. Janelle Wong, and she is Professor of American Studies and a core faculty member in the Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland. And she specializes in race, immigration, and political mobilization. She is the author, most recently, of Immigrants, Evangelicals, and Politics in an Era of Demographic Change. And she was a co-principal investigator of the 2016 National Asian American Survey, which was a nationwide survey of Asian American political and social attitudes. And she's also the co-principal investigator of the 2020 Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey, funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation. So she is routinely sought out for commentary in the national media. And so Dr. Wong, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And we also have Dr. Jamil Drake, and he is Assistant Professor of American Religious History at Florida State University. and he specializes in 20th century African-American religious cultures, religion and politics, and religion and popular culture. So he's currently working on a history of race and class in American religion, tentatively titled To Know the Soul of the People, American Folk Studies and Racial Politics of Popular Religion, 1900 to 1940. So this work will show us how the study of race and religion became a central topic in folklore research and the developing social sciences in the first half of the 20th century. So Dr. Drake, thank you as well for your time today and welcome. And so with that, I will pass it off to Amanda to get us started in our discussion.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Joseph. Yeah, this is pretty exciting to bring together this group of folks. Maybe there's some out there who feel like there isn't one more thing to be said about the 2020 election, but in fact, we are just getting started. As we'll talk about in a bit, the more data that we can collect and the more that we start to break down what exactly happened, particularly when it comes to vote choice, etc., we will learn more about how religion was at work in various areas of this election and also those results. I was reflecting this past election season that I started my PhD in 2007. So this was my fourth presidential election. And so 2008 was, this wonderful way to start out my political science career. And since that time, I've only gotten more confused about what it is that we know or don't know about the American electorate. So I'm very excited to hear insight from our panelists today and also for Andrew and I to share a bit of our perspectives. So I want to begin by opening with our panelists in giving a brief overview of sort of your reactions and broader thoughts about how you saw religion at play in the campaigns and the lead and the rhetoric and the narratives up to the election, and then kind of during and after the election, but just kind of start us off with the way that you thought religion was perhaps at work in some of these themes. And I'd like to start with Dr. Wong. So Janelle, if you could start us off.
Sure, thank you so much. And it's a little intimidating being with this really star panel. But let me just say that, like others, I have been interested in changes from 2016, especially among different religious voters. And I definitely don't want to obsess over the exit polls, but I can't help myself a little bit that, I want to comment on some of the noteworthy trends, and we can debate about this a little bit. So I think it is safe to say that white evangelicals, this is a group I never set out to study. I was trying to always focus on evangelicals, non-white evangelicals, but they just keep centering themselves.
Janelle, if I can stop you just a second, I think your sound went out.
Perhaps we could go to Dr. Drake while we wait.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm so honored to be on this panel, and I look forward to this sort of conversation. I also look forward to not only contributing, but also look forward to learning too as well. For me, I mean, on one level, I just have to start with just the basic of me just being sort of like, frustrated, full of anxiety, almost a kind of psychosomatic kind of feeling going into before, during, and also after this sort of election. But for me, just to sum it up, I mean, it's sort of what Amir Baraka called in his Blues People, the changing same. What pundits are calling Trumpism for people, for communities of color. I mean, Trumpism is sort of, just sort of white supremacy, right, in some ways. And, race still governs, if you will, not only the soul of America, but still governs sort of religion in America. And so, for me as a religious historian, I mean, I was very interested, in just the ways in which, each, the Biden as well as the Trump campaign, the ways in which, race kind of showed up in the ways in which they were thinking about religion. And it got me thinking about, the antecedents of the 1960s, right? So, thinking about law and order, thinking about, voter suppression, thinking about, suburban women, and thinking about, private property, thinking about socialism. And yes, these things have a lot to do with how religion is mapped onto the sort of political landscape and the ways in which race is just very much a part of the ways in which, different demographics are mapped racially. And so, as a religious historian, I kept thinking about the antecedents that got us to this point. Because in some ways, it is so easy for us just to blame Trump for all the kind of ugliness of American racism, and particularly its relationship to religion. But at the end of the day, Trump just brought out what America really is. And, not only what America really is, but the stories we tell ourselves. So it's very important that even if we're telling the same old stories, the antecedents that led to Trump, that we really tell the old stories and focus on, particular themes of race and its relationship to the carceral state, private property, suburban women, and so forth. We can put greater emphasis there, even if we're telling old stories, because we need new stories to account for the antecedents that caused or allowed for Trump to be here, that tell us a lot about what America, what America is, and what America and how Americans take themselves, I guess, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, Janelle, maybe we have you back. Sorry.
Well, maybe Andrew, why don't you kind of build on the themes I think that, Janelle was starting to talk about with white evangelicals keep centering things, and that's your wheelhouse, of course. And not you being the you know what I mean. And then also what Jamil was talking about with regard to how 2020 isn't really anything new. As a political scientist, I can just look at those state electoral maps and what colors they are, and not a lot of I mean, there were a few shocks or changes this year, which we can talk about, but this is pretty standard kind of thing. And I think that your work on Christian nationalism, tells us a lot about that. So maybe you could speak a bit about that in this election.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Yeah, I appreciate, Dr. Drake, what you were saying, where we have to attend to the history, right? What brought us here. This isn't something that just popped up. And that is so true that Trump, and there's many people that are writing different works looking at not only religion and race, but religion and gender, and showing how a lot of these themes, Trump is kind of the natural endpoint of a project that goes back 40, 50, 60, and obviously with race, hundreds of years. And so I just so appreciate that, and that is so important. And I think one thing that, as talking with different people or watching us progress through this fall and through the election, just coming back to how religion in the US, we have to understand that it is raced, that it isn't something that's outside of race, but that these things clearly overlap. And so in our work with Christian nationalism, and especially white Christian nationalism, I think this really draws it out that when, Jamil, when you were talking about these different phrases that Trump's using, like law and order or suburban women, these are inherently racialized, kind of coded things. But then too, when he uses religious rhetoric, in the same way, it's racialized in that sense, where it has a specific message that, again, comes with historical baggage. And so when he's using those things and saying those things, it was speaking to a particular group. And as Amanda mentioned at the beginning, and she's right on, that this was naturally for some groups, when we look at 2016, for white evangelicals and many white Christians, they came out and supported Trump. Now there were, some changes maybe at the margins, but I think too, as Amanda said, the exit polls tell us one thing, but I think, as we gather more data and a bit more systematic data, being able to really fine tune and see, well, where were those changes as we look back. But I look forward to kind of talk about and share, and I can do it now or maybe later when, we talk about even the religious, traditions that, like Joe Biden, as a Catholic, the Catholic vote, especially the white Catholic vote, where he, did slightly better than Hillary, but, almost 50% still voted for Trump. And so what's going on there? And I think Christian nationalism helps us explain across these religious denominations, what's going on, because we can still, there are still white evangelicals that aren't voting for him. So that isn't just the whole story, but some of these cultural frameworks that these groups use that are racialized. And so Christian nationalism is racialized. It's part of that historical project. So that's something that we're looking at and gathering data on that we can get into, or I can share a little bit. But those are some of the first things that I'm thinking about. And two, I know there's more that we'll get into because 2020 election isn't quite over, right? We have a runoff in Georgia that, Dr. Drake brought up earlier. So we'll have to talk through that as well. But I think, Janelle, I think we might have you calling in. And so we'd love to hear too your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great. So first of all, thanks again for having me here. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. And let me just jump in that, in Georgia, which is on everybody's mind, we do know that about at least 85% of white evangelicals in that state did support Trump. And that's, there's a little bit of variation in the different exit polls, but I think the bottom line is there has been no, as Amanda said, there's been no clear erosion of white evangelical support for Trump, even though we've seen, there's no evidence of that, but we've seen nonstop evidence really of Trump's anti-immigrant racist rhetoric. And I think most of us agree here that that is really the driver that we need to understand among that group, that Trump's agenda on immigration, Trump's agenda on race, and on his attitudes about police and the police brutality is really the same agenda that white evangelicals hold. And I know most of you have done some research on this. And I think the thing to drive home is that really not about abortion alone, that we see, lots of data, not from exit polls, that show us that only 30% of white evangelicals say that they would vote for, they have to vote for someone who shares their stance on abortion. Most evangelicals didn't think that Trump's appointees would actually overturn Roe v. Wade. And so obviously something else is going on. The thing that struck me about the exit polls, and this is partly a question, but it's also that they seem to be making up even more of a proportion of the electorate, according to some exit polls, than in the past. How can this be? We know that, that group continues to make up at least 1 out of every 4 voters, at least. It's a little bit higher even in this round, even though there's probably flaws, while their share of the overall population has dropped about 8 percentage points over the past decade. I think this is an area we really need to dig into. Is this group we know is fired up by issues like immigration, critiques of racial discrimination and policing, but that's a really outsized impact. And I actually really thought non-white evangelicals were going to change the narrative on evangelicals more generally in 2016, but that group continues to be underrepresented in the electorate. So obviously it's just another data point that shows that demography is not destiny when it comes to electoral politics.
Also voter suppression. I mean, that's like half the answer there, right? Is where these people are voting and so on. And I think, this year, and how elections are conducted is not the focus of this conversation, but I think that political scientists are going to be doing a lot of good work in the coming years, analyzing what happened this year with regard to early voting and absentee ballots and drop-off sites and the nonsense in Pennsylvania about the, pristine envelope going around the other thing and all this kind of stuff. And then what's happening in Michigan right now with the certification of votes, et cetera, that is like not even a dog whistle anymore. It's literally, we don't want to count the Detroit votes, right? I mean, this is just like unbelievable. It is believable, right? It's just they're saying the quiet parts out loud, which I think is part of the answer. And saying the quiet parts out loud is both attracting and turning out white evangelical Christian nationalists, but then also actively suppressing and or demobilizing perhaps, some evangelicals who are perhaps Latinx, African American, and so on. So yeah, definitely something to keep our eyes on with those things. And then, yeah, well, why don't we move then from kind of our general comments to thinking about, let's talk about Georgia. So you've hinted around at that. This is a really interesting opportunity because we don't often have, when I teach Intro to American Politics, we always have a little section about who's in Congress and what kinds of jobs do they have, right? And this is a fascinating, we don't often get a reverend who is running for office. So it's a very easy, low-hanging fruit to talk about religion and the Georgia runoff. So maybe we'll start with Jamil to have a conversation about the candidates there.
Yeah, no, thank you. I have Georgia on my mind. I actually grew up in Lithonia in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Stone Mountain, Georgia is sort of by 1915 is the haven for the second Ku Klux Klan revitalization, right? But if you think about Georgia, with Georgia on my mind, and you think about, right now I live in North Florida, but we're getting campaign ads from Georgia given our proximity to South Georgia. But there's a way in which we saw what happened to, former President Obama, where, the ways in which he was actually demonized was through having sort of bad religion vis-a-vis Jeremiah Wright. Now Warnock is being targeted, by his actually competitors, whether they are talking about Abyssinian, a very historic, prominent church. We're thinking about Adam Clayton Powell Sr. We're thinking about Adam Clayton Powell Jr. We're thinking about Samuel Proctor. Now we're thinking, and now we're thinking about its place in sort of like history. Now they're, running campaign ads that, show that, in some ways they're trying to communicate that Black religion is so un-American, are so dangerous. And this is part of the racialization of religion that's at play, by bringing up stories where Raphael Warnock supposedly attended a church that, celebrated Fidel Castro, who actually came to Abyssinian in 1995. And Raphael Warnock is at, Ebenezer Baptist Church with its long-standing history with, MLK, Martin King, Senior as well as Junior. But in some ways, Black religion, if we think about in its history, the Nation of Islam, or if we think about Black Protestantism as being communist, a socialist to delegitimize dissent, we're witnessing that now with Raphael Warnock, who's being demonized for having bad religion, which is part of the kind of racialization project to show that Black people are un-American, are socialist and dangerous, and we need to contain them and, get rid of their bad religion. I'll stop there.
Yeah, if I can jump in off of that, I think it is fascinating, and I think what you're pointing out is right on, because as we look at the quest to define who is American, who is truly American, and this idea of a Christian nation, and when we ask Americans, they're pretty innocuous questions like, should the federal government support Christian values in the public square or allow religious symbols in public spaces? And so in these questions, we don't ask anything about race. What we find over and over is that when we see if they're associated with racist or racialized views, they're the strongest predictor. And so there's something going on with this idea of a Christian nation, or what it means to be a true American if being a Christian is part of it, and essentially saying being white. And we also find that there's this undercurrent of authoritarianism and militarism. And so what I'm thinking of is yesterday with obviously Kelly Loeffler is attacking, Pastor Warnock and taking, a bit of his sermon and out of context. And he's literally quoting from the Bible, but they're saying this is not, this is un-American. And so it was funny to see some of the responses online and follow how people were reacting to it. And they were saying too, just imagine if they knew that, what else is in the Bible or what other Christians really did believe. But they're saying, well, since it's really pointing to this is coming from a Black person, and so it's un-American because, attacking, the new Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, we shouldn't attack her because of religion, but then with Pastor Warnock, it was turned so people were raising those questions. But again, this idea of what it means to be a true American is to support the military, and really it's being white, and that religion needs to come from a white space to be. So just following that online, we see with how Americans view this idea of a Christian nation is inherently racialized. And we can see that playing out even among senators like Marco Rubio, who kind of explicitly pulled those threads together on Twitter.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
And also the ways in which, just the kind of the contradictions, the way in which Mitch McConnell, after his sort of, victory speech, is incorporating the very thing that Raphael Warnock is being demonized for. So Mitch McConnell is using Martin Luther King or the popular narratives, which neoconservatives seem to do, as well as, liberal Democrats too, as well. They popularize or incorporate a particular kind of narrative of the civil rights movement, and they use it for their own ideology, while at the same time, demonizing, Pastor Raphael Warnock for the very things that, the civil rights movement actually stood for. And so here is the kind of the paradox and the ways in which paying attention to, ideology and the ways in which it works, and just the contradictions that's through and through in these sort of campaigns.
I don't mean to shock anybody, but, politicians use religion for a particular purpose. Like, I don't think that being consistent is necessarily at the top of the list. And, my approach in my research is basically that religion is just another form of politics to me. I think that people subscribe to a certain set of beliefs or elect into a particular belief set or affiliation or stay in that affiliation or interpret that affiliation in a way that lines up with their politics and lines up with the way that they want to order society. And I think that is ever at work when you look at, a lot of these results, and Andrew touched on this with thinking about authoritarianism, but racial resentment, authoritarianism, hostile sexism basically explains most of the variance in why people are attracted to Trump and continue to vote for that party and so on. It's just consistent across the board. And so, for our purposes, we'd like to say that people are somehow reading the Bible or reading their holy book. And, it's this, they read this one verse and that's really what led them to this belief set. But I think we pretty much know it goes the other direction, right? And we all know this from studying religion. People do this in other parts of life, right? Like they select the parts of the Bible that they get to, or their holy book and so on, that they apply to various kinds of things. So, yeah, I always tell my students, like, if you're looking to politicians, to demonstrate a good way of behaving, you may want to step back and see what's kind of at work there. And so maybe I'm just cynical about that kind of thing. One of the things I did want to talk about, building off of the Georgia Senate race, is this year we will have one of the most diverse Congresses in our history. We have more women elected to Congress, more women of color elected to Congress, and the more women elected to Congress also include more Republican women. Right? So we have some really interesting things with gender and race happening. But if you look closely at the people who are elected, this doesn't necessarily mean more diversity religiously. Right? So, but from some of my work, and I know some of the work that Janelle has done and others, we know that women and men, for example, may express their religious identity differently. They may use religion differently. And so perhaps our panelists can talk a little bit about how this new Congress, might start to display a different way of how we've seen religion at work in those public spaces.
Yeah, I really appreciate that attention. You know, there's in the field that I'm in, race and politics, there's been this really furious kind of intense discussion about whether or not Trump was able to consolidate people of color, men of color, and I think it overlaps with this discussion. And, you know, I'm of two kinds of hot takes on this kind of point, which is, the first is that it's pretty clear that, you know, people of color really, Joe Biden needed people of color to win. They provided that, that coalition strength there. At the same time, I think we do need, and this is where the debate is, I think we do need to recognize exactly what you're talking about, Amanda, which is that, you know, our communities of color are not, we are subject to the same forces that the general American population is subject to in some ways in terms of racism and sexism. And so, you know, yeah, I see among Asian Americans like a little bit of a tick up towards Trump. It's not overwhelming. They certainly didn't vote for him in a majority, but there's a little tick up, and we see it maybe, I don't really see it, but some have argued that there was a little tick up among Latinx evangelicals, let's say. And why is that? And we see this with Republican women too, because there is, you know, hostile sexism is driving that vote to some extent. And Trump has had 4 years of campaigning and had that bullhorn for 4 years. And that also affects communities of color. And, you know, within non-Black communities, you also see anti-Black racism it's not a driving force, but it explains a lot of the Trump vote, right? And so the things that you're talking about, I think, are there. We are all subject to these like really nefarious forces that were unleashed during the last 4 years.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great point. And sometimes, you know, I get asked, is there anything different about, you know, Trump being in office with you kind of talking about the bully pulpit that he's had for 4 years. And so a lot of kind of this underlying, you know, whether it's Christian nationalism or these other forces that Amanda pointed out, it isn't as though these are new, but they do have a much more pronounced, you know, they're being pronounced from a much more powerful place. And so that is going to have an effect in the culture and kind of what we see on the margins there. But I think too, what's interesting with, again, exit polls, having to be careful with those, and as we gather more data, but to see among, you know, Latinx or Hispanic populations, there was interesting data from PRRI where in their 2020 survey, you know, looking at and identifying the differences between whether somebody, and using their terms, you know, is Hispanic and Protestant or Hispanic and Catholic, and how different they were. And so as we talk about these racial differences, again, we have to attend to religion because those things can't necessarily be separated. And so I'm looking at particular counties, you know, Miami-Dade, and thinking about particular populations there, whether it's, you know, men or broadly Cuban populations, and how for many of them, how they understand themselves racially, but then also their religion, you know, is going to tell part of this story. And again, it's so early, but I think that's what we'll be digging into and probably seeing some of these trends play out as we're able to gather data and really, you know, get a handle on what happened. But yeah, I really appreciate those points.
Yeah.
Can I add something really brief about, go ahead, Dr. Drake. Well, really brief on this topic of Latinx evangelicals, and I'll make it brief, is that, you know, there has been this hand wringing, but really when you look at the data, it seems like there wasn't much movement among Latinx evangelicals. You know, Pew had them at 47% for Trump in 2016. Surveys I've seen are around that range. Latinx Catholics as well. I think what's interesting here is that, you know, Trump made this concerted effort to reach out to evangelicals in Miami. Okay, you can talk about this too. I would love to hear what Dr. Drake says about this. You know, that Hispanic mega church in Miami at the beginning of the year, 2 days before the election again. I want to just bring this up, that Biden rolled out Creyentes con Biden, right? This Believers for Biden, literally 6 weeks before the election. So I'm a little worried about this. The Koch brothers started funding Latino Protestant outreach before 2016. Democrats are always coming around to minority communities paying attention to these intersections, you know, religion, race, not, you know, they do it 6 weeks before an election, not 6 years. That was my critique of the Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, on one level, you just think that Biden was paying too much attention to, you know, white voters, and trying to actually target, you know, the sort of working class white voters who, you know, maybe might have left, you know, the Democratic Party or whatever their vote, and
They're gone. They're gone.
Yeah,
They're gone.
We have to complicate these
They're
categories.
gone.
Yeah, we have to complicate these categories, but you know, I mean, in some ways, I think Biden was so focused on, you know, getting a particular kind of white voter, you know, and that sometimes, you know, you homogenize other racial communities and you say the Black vote, I'll take care of that, or the Latino vote, I'll take care of that, even though it's last minute, like you said, but not really paying real attention to the specificity of the issues at play. So, I mean, equally as we talk about, you know, Trump, we have to definitely talk about the shortcomings, as, you know, Janelle, you noted, on the kind of, you know, the Democratic, on, you know, Biden and the Democratic Party too as well. And to think about, you know, also these changing sort of demographics as we think about Georgia, and, you know, Cobb County and stuff like that. Supposedly now, you know, with the younger generation, these quote unquote religious nuns are having an impact, and they might have demographic shifts that might, you know, that, you know, white evangelicals may not be able to catch up to, that they're still stuck in a kind of early 2000 model as the demography sort of shifts, particularly with these young voters who are not identifying with a particular kind of maybe a religious organization. So that's something to take into account too as well.
Yeah, I mean, Professor Ryan Burge, who is, if you don't follow him on Twitter, every day he will give you something new about religion and something politics related with very cool R data viz. But yeah, he has put out a few results this week looking at, you know, kind of basically saying nuns helped give the election to Biden, right? And so in these key places, so if we want to talk about Detroit, Milwaukee, Atlanta, and about African-American voters also being key, that the nuns in some of these places, and the nuns more likely to be white, you know, being key. But this also brings up, we could talk about Maricopa County in Arizona, right? And I think that what's been really fascinating about this year is I think we are looking, I think there is more of a conversation about, you know, beyond just religion being white evangelicals, but I think about the Native vote, right? So there's a lot of conversations about New Mexico and, you know, how, you know, the large turnout from the Native American folks in those communities. And with Deb Haaland and Sharice David, the two Native American Congress members, and people are talking about if Deb Haaland would be appointed Secretary of the Interior, what a difference that would make. And I think that, and you know, this maybe just feels like we're having a race conversation, but we aren't in that. You know, indigenous religions have such a different way of approaching the natural world and the environment and so on, as compared to, you know, let's just, you know, Western empire-based Christian religions, that you could see some interesting conversations around Native beliefs and their approaches to environmental policies, concerns, and so on, and that you could see this grow as, you know, we have these two members of Congress already elected, and there might have been another one or two, I forget. But I think that's another conversation, right? Is sort of some of the minority religions at work. And I know maybe Janelle, you wanted to talk a bit about the Asian American vote and thinking, you know, particularly with Vice President-elect Harris and her ecumenical background, and how those conversations might help us think about a White House that isn't just, I mean, yeah, Protestant Christian.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think when I think about Asian Americans, I often think about evangelicals, but they're also the group that has the largest proportion of religiously unaffiliated people. So they're always an interesting group to me. And, you know, my next project is looking really at those who are not religiously identified and race, because we still see racial differences within that category of like agnostics, atheists, and decline to state the religious affiliation. It's different. You know, everyone's on the left, but you have this, when we talk about religious nuns in the electorate, this vision comes up of like the white guy who's like the Bernie supporter, right? But really there's so many, that group is growing so fast. It's always been big among Asian Americans, but it's growing very fast among Black and Latinx voters. And we still see, you know, race matters there. Partisanship really matters also among religious nuns. And so that is an area, when I think about Kamala Harris, I mean, that's another very interesting change that's coming. We know that, you know, basically Mike Pence has been kind of like a religious mascot for the Christian right. But Kamala Harris is not going to play that kind of role. So Kamala Harris, you know, her mother was practiced Hinduism. Her upbringing was really, you know, the African-American Baptist tradition. Her husband is Jewish. She has like some tensions with different, like, you know, I'm interested to see how Catholics understand her. She's been criticized for really not going after Catholics in the abuse scandals that when she was a prosecutor. So there's just a lot going on with Kamala Harris. And the one thing that's clear is she's not going to be that religious mascot. Who does she represent for people? This religious pluralism, which is a totally different model than we've seen. She might take the attention off white evangelicals for a little while.
Andrew, do you have any final thoughts before we maybe turn to Q&A?
Yeah, well, I think one thing, and we still are waiting on, you know, January 5th, the runoff, so it seems like 2020 is not yet over, but two, maybe really quick before we turn to Q&A, and I'll start looking at those while perhaps you three give some thoughts on this, is if we do have a change in the administration on Inauguration Day, which I hate to say if, but, you know, there's a lot of shenanigans happening right now. But when that happens, Trumpism isn't going to go away, and his following and you know, isn't going to go away. And there are plenty of Americans that will probably still feel like he was the rightful winner. And so in 2024, I mean, and again, as probably historians and social scientists, we hate to make any predictions, but as we look over the next 4 years, what do we see happening with religion and politics? And the fact that, again, Trump wasn't just an aberration, but was, you know, a natural progression of decades and centuries of race and religion here in the US. But now over the next 4 years, what do we see, perhaps some storylines to keep track of or to think of, or what will you be looking at as we go over the next 4 years? And then I'll start looking at the Q&A while, you know, I listen.
Yeah, I'm not going to be much creative here. You know, in some ways, it is again the kind of change in saint, but it is an opportunity for us in the academy and beyond to think seriously about how we quantify religion, right? And so often we think about, you know, the kind of the quote unquote alt-right, and my mind goes back to the Atlantic story on Richard Spencer, and the alt-right. And he says, look, you know, he's at a Christmas party, supposedly, with Richard Dawkins going off and on about, you know, why the myth of God needs to be taken out of the holidays and stuff like that. And Spencer goes to the journalist from the Atlantic, I think his name is Graham Wood. And he says, look, Dawkins misses the point. This is not about arguments about belief or whether you believe in God. Christianity is central for the white ethno-state. And so in some ways, what I would like to see is, you know, there is a kind of politics of respectability when we think about white evangelicals, and we think about those at the center, but vis-a-vis those on the fringes. But what if the fringes, the QAnon and the QAnon and stuff are actually at the center of American religion? and stop, thinking about the politics of respectability to save white evangelicals, and think about the ways in which Paul Ryan and others, as we see with, Reagan and the Birchers, as in some ways they're working hand in hand to sort of stop deodorizing, if you will, these white evangelicals who are actually at the center. Even Barack Obama is talking about, I just can't believe that Mark Rubio and them would fall to Trumpism and stuff like that. I can't believe we're not talking about facts. I'm like, wake up. This is America. They're at the center. And we have to be serious and intentional about the stories we tell. And I'll just kind of stop there. I don't think anything will change, but I am interested in this sort of the nuns and these other sort of religious demographics too as well.
Amanda?
Actually, I saw a Q&A question that I want to kind of build off of from Brian Steensland about can Democrats basically build a religious coalition of sorts? And I just kind of think it doesn't matter. I think that, one of the things that we have been learning over the last probably 20 years from people on the ground, and I think probably the most famous of this was Beto O'Rourke had basically a memo that he put out about all the problems with the Democratic ground game, right? And some of this was pandemic related, right? So if you don't believe the pandemic's real, you just go knock on doors, and that's what the Republicans did, right? And so I think that I don't know that religion is the way to go with the increasing amount of people who are disaffiliating and the way that people can be turned off, and just the diversification of the American religious landscape. I think focus on policies and, focus on, continuing the Democratic Party is a loose coalition of groups that is a big tent that includes a lot of different people that want things from government. The Republican Party is a philosophical party that is about a certain set of values. These are different groups, and I think trying to play the Republican game with Democrat potentials isn't going to work. So I guess I would argue that they should just be ecumenical and welcoming and not denigrating beliefs by any stretch of things. But I don't know that, trying to build a coalition among, something like Cuban American voters, what, of course, drives us political scientists nuts is we're like, yeah, you mean the people who left Cuba because they were, basically white presenting landowners somehow like Trump and Republicans? Yeah, that tracks, right? And so I think that, yeah, I don't think the Democrats should play the game that the Republicans do, but I do think they need to fix their field offices. They need to get more people in these spaces where we have, the folks who've been organizing for decades in Georgia, who have been organizing for decades in Mississippi and Alabama, and give them some help. But I don't think you need to use religious rhetoric to do it. I think you just need to be there and support with resources if you're the Democratic Party.
Well, there was one question that I'd like to bring up from Nancy Ammerman, where she said the nuns are indeed fascinating. How can we better understand who they are hanging with? So if political identity and activity is communally mediated, whether it's through religious institutions, I would say, or political, what do we make of their lack of affiliation? So unaffiliated religiously, but yet where are those connections happening? I'm wondering if you all have thoughts, or as we kind of mentioned nuns a bit ago.
I mean, here's where they're really at a disadvantage, right? Because one of the fascinating things about, white evangelicals is they have this really perfect kind of institutional structure for sharing political information and building community in this kind of warm, welcoming environment, right? Welcoming to some people. And, when you study people who are not religiously affiliated, then you're looking at things like, you're looking at institutions like unions, like advocacy organizations. Those are just much less present in people's day-to-day lives. And so I think this is an area where, what is holding that group together? They are held together by, I think, some of the things that Amanda is talking about. It's not just despising Trump and his rhetoric, but it's really about like a certain set of values, very simple values that do work for the Democrats, which is like, what's the role of government in daily in daily life and support. That separates religious nuns from the religious, so they're more likely to want a big government with more services. That separates also people of color from white people. So you see that the majority of whites are more likely to say they want a smaller government with fewer services. You know, Black and Latinx and Asian American voters, over and over again, they say they want a bigger government with more services. And so you can see the outlines of coalition, not around religious rhetoric, not around really identities, if that, you know, yes, identity politics matters, but it's really about these kind of fundamental understandings of the role of government.
But if you ask about, if you say, do you want more government protections, et cetera? Yes, whites say they do not. But if you say, do you want a minimum wage? Do you want affordable health care? We know that the overwhelming majority of Americans across races want progressive policies. They just won't take on that identity. And some of that does have to do with religion, right? So this idea of being operationally liberal, but symbolically conservative. You know, and I think, you know, we could talk about guns, but that's kind of a place where I think that policy, you know, plays out the most.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that real quick, Amanda. When you brought up guns, I completely agree, because it always, to me, is a little bit, I always chuckle a little bit when I see people say things like, you know, 70, 80% of Americans support, you know, background checks or something like that. And a part of me is like, that's great, but that's just not how this works, where, oh, a lot of people support it. It isn't going to be then that this is going to be any easier to go through or push through anything like that, for those reasons you mentioned. Now, if I can, I want to bring up another question. So what do you think the long-term effects will be of the GOP policymakers, quote unquote, saying the quiet part out loud with regard to racism and sexism? So their question two, a follow-up, will overt racism among white evangelicals force Americans to face its white supremacist past? And so just to kind of bookend this question, you know, there was an interview in the Atlantic with megachurch pastor Andy Stanley, who's in Georgia, where he was saying that we're kind of, in a couple of years, Trumpism will be kind of like a fever dream. You know, we're going to kind of forget it. And there were some people thinking through, you know, his thoughts. And so I think, you know, his thoughts about what this means is of a particular answer to this question. I'm wondering what some of your responses are, the ways you're thinking about this. Will this have a reckoning of sorts into the future? What has happened over the last 4 to 5 years?
My reading of history is that America is sort of, you know, based off a series of betrayals and the kind of the ways in which they, you know, in some ways, and I say they, America, you know, is sort of, you know, against a kind of, you know, multiracial democracy. And so I don't even really think about, you know, the ways in which, you know, Trump being honest. I think the conditions of possibility was the rhetoric that was implicit in their racism, that gave him the kind of open door and that firmed the conditions of possibility for his elections. And so I'm just as, you know, nervous, not just about, you know, Trump, but even more nervous about the rhetoric that, you know, has been sort of racially coded without saying white power. So, you know, and it's in the policy, whether it's the criminalization, the carceral state and others. And, you know, for me, you know, I'm in Florida, I'm looking in the Capitol with DeSantis and these laws that are coming from DeSantis with voting suppression, as well as criminalizing protests.
Right.
You know, and he's not saying white power, but I get it, you know, and that rhetoric, and we have to be serious about the history and the stories we tell ourselves. And, you know, again, you know, Trump being outright racist and stuff like that, it is the people within the sort of the coded language that made his rhetoric or made him possible. And they're just as guilty, whether it's outright or not. But I still don't think, with all that is happening with police brutality, with all that is happening with Black bodies being killed, that America will ever face the truth and turn from its wicked ways, the original sin of race. So, you know, but then again, I don't think if we're mobilizing, we should be worried about that.
Yeah, I think the persuasion factor, people just need to get over that. That's not happening, right? So the people who were mobilized perhaps after Trump to participate in the Women's March, or who maybe started participating in some of the Black Lives Matters marches and so on. A lot of these folks were previously just not interested or not terribly involved in politics. It's not like a bunch of coal miners or whatever are suddenly now interested because they care about this thing. So I think mobilization of previously unaffiliated or previously uninterested Americans is more of an answer to try to just insulate our institutions from this. But these are institutions that are built on colonial empire and a carceral state. Why this works for a lot of people? Why would they go against that? They'll tell themselves all day long that doesn't mean because it's racist. The other thing is just look around the world. Rise of right-wing populism, xenophobia, all these things are happening everywhere. Even in the most beautiful Scandinavian egalitarian countries, you have this happening. So I don't, this idea somehow that people are going to wake up one day and read their Bibles and decide they need to not be racist, I think is a ridiculous thing to assume. Again, looking at history and looking at the current moment we have at, everywhere else in the world. So if you're a person who wants to try to change the future of this country, you're better off trying to mobilize the people who are already not as terribly racist or from underrepresented groups than you are in trying to change the minds of those other folks.
I think we assume that some people, like white evangelicals, would try to ride this wave of demographic change. Like, ooh, there's new people that we can bring into our fold. No, they doubled down on exclusion, and that's what we're seeing today. Nobody's going down without a fight.
Well, I think we may have time for one more question, if that's all right. And this one is actually directed to you, Janelle, from Stephen Hugh. What factors do you see as pushing some Asian Americans, and here he is thinking specifically Chinese Americans, toward Trump in the past 4 years? So from cursory observation, he's seen that those who support Trump are typically foreign-born or mainland-born Chinese who are Christians and very anti-CCP. Are there other factors driving this particular demographic toward conservative and an ethno-religious politics?
Yes. So those are all good factors. I think we can see through the most visible way that Chinese Americans have shown up in U.S. politics recently is over opposing affirmative action. This is at the exact same time we see Black leadership standing with Asian Americans when it comes to opposing COVID-related anti-Asian bias. And what drives it? I mean, our survey data show anti-Black attitudes and a sense of, Chinese American nationalism drive this. It's not that complicated really in terms of those forces.
Interesting, thank you. All right, well, I think we're at our end time. And so, I guess just for me, and then I'll pass it to Amanda, thank you so much, Jamil and Janelle, for taking the time, sharing your expertise, and being a part of Religion and in this ongoing conversation. It's been really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you again. Some of the questions in the chat, definitely if you all are interested in learning more about a lot of these connections, the CVs of a lot of people on this call are probably a good place to start. Not me, I look at such micro foundation stuff, I don't even do vote choice, but everybody else is a great place to start. And we want to invite you to our very next Religion and series, and it's going to be, and I think we might have a slide. Perfect. So this is going to be Religion and Pandemics, Vaccines, and Public Policy. We spent almost no time talking about the pandemic today. And so if you want to know more about how religion is at work with this, please tune in December 17th. Again, all of these webinars are being recorded and are available on the the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture website. They're great things to use in your classrooms, perhaps to get students to have kind of a quick take on a lot of these issues. And thank you again for everyone who tuned in, and we hope to see you another time.
Thank you all.